Hi. For a few months, I've been considering a blog with the above title of The Thoughts of an Old Fart. And since I'm now in my 80s, I thought, why not? After all, I am certainly an old fart, and I will leave it to you to decide if my thoughts have any value. At any rate, I will attempt to bring the view of someone who grew up in the 50s and apply that view to today's events. I have a lot of different interests, so don't be surprised we dive into sports, history, fads, and of course politics. Currently, the main concern I currently have revolves around what Trump has done to the political process. I fear it will not bode well for the future. At any rate, you have time? Here are some of my thoughts. I've been wondering about how we've gotten to the point where people on two sides of a debate no longer listen to one another, but seem to take delight in trying to outshout one another and believe the information provided by the opposite side is either a distortion or an out and out lie. This has resulted in that each side, instead of trying to find common ground, end up defending their position no matter what the cost is to the country as a whole. The United States was founded on two basic groups of individuals. The first group saw their individual states as the center, and that are their colony, and that the people of their state had the right and obligation to determine what was right for their individual state. They were bright enough to know that there were certain things that could not be done on their own. They realized that to become free, they needed to join with other states to defeat a common enemy. And if they were to prosper, they needed trade agreements. And if they were to communicate with each other, a system had to be developed to send messages to one another. They knew something needed to be done at a level higher than what an individual state could manage. The second group saw beyond the needs of each individual state and saw the advantages of a federal system. They saw two main issues, one which they agreed with the other side, and that is, in order to defeat a common enemy, they had to join together. And the second thing they wanted to do is to develop a system that allowed commerce between the states for the advantage of all. Both groups agreed that no one individual or group should hold all the power to govern, and came up with a system of checks and balances to prevent that from happening. Unfortunately, Washington was the wrong first president for those who supported the idea of another king. Political parties developed over time around the principle of state power versus federal power. In the beginning, the state of corporation continued, and the idea of compromising was developed into a fine art. Unfortunately, as time went on, and as the founding fathers began to die out, the art of compromising began to fade. By the 1850s, lines began to be drawn in the state, and when the Republicans nominated an individual that stood for policies that strengthened the federal government and would allow the federal government to impose restrictions on state rights, they could no longer talk but act. Sound a little familiar? For nearly 100 years, Republicans would be shut out of the South, but over that time, the two Democratic parties would go through a transformation. The first to change would be the Democratic Party, and then the Republican Party. The Republican Party at first saw little need for change. It held control of the White House and Congress from 1860 until 1912, except for the two times that Cleveland got in there. During this time, the Republicans believed in government being actively involved in trade decisions, the gold standard, and developing what needed to gain the support of the wealthy. The Democrats, on the other hand, had been reduced to champion state rights, and most of their support came from the South. Then, in 1896, a young 36-year-old lawyer won the Democratic nomination for president, and things began to change for the Democratic Party. He would not win. In fact, he would fail 3 times trying to become president. But he did set a new standard for the Democrats. His speech, the Cross of Gold, attracted big city businesses and sided with the common man, the farmers, the miners, the steel workers, and rural America. This standard would be picked up by Wilson, FDR, Kennedy, Johnson, Clinton, Carter, Obama, and today it's being championed by Biden. The Republican Party, however, continued to win the White House until 1912. In 1912, the Republicans developed a split personality. Half the party wanted to develop laws to protect women and children in the workplace, favored conservation reforms, labor unions, wanted judges to be elected. The more conservative elements wanted to increase tariffs, favor big business, wanted judges appointed, and in the end, the two groups could not agree, and a third party was formed. It would be the only time in U.S. history where a third party actually ended up in second place in a presidential election, and the Democrats had elected only their second man to the office since before 1860. The individuals that remained in the Republican Party were the individuals that believed in more conservative political views, and the party moved from one that supported federal power over state power to one that thought less government was better and that the individual should not be impeded by government interference. In 1920, the Republicans returned to the White House using the slogan, "A return to normalcy," and they repeated in 24 and 28 as the good times had arrived. 1929 ended the good times. The Democrat candidate promised a New Deal in 1932. His ideas attracted the more progressive Republicans, appealed to the working man, and maintained the Democrats' hold on the South. FDR took an idea that he felt would work to improve the economy of America. He prepared for a war he knew was coming. The result in a number of socialist ideas became part of the New Deal. It also ended with his huge re-election in 1936. Election victory was so big that many predicted the end of the Republican Party. By 1944, the Republicans had found their new voice. They campaigned against the New Deal, sought smaller government and less regulated government. These principles remain to this day. The 1948 election is noted for two things. The one everybody remembers is the upset of Truman over Dewey. But the more important event was the Democratic Party embracing civil rights platform. This resulted in the South producing a third candidate, and the migration of Southern voters from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party had begun. In 1952, Republicans looked to a war hero to return to power. Eisenhower was a moderate and had been seriously looked at by the Democrats in 1948. He was the first candidate to make an effort to appeal to women voters, the first to successfully use fear as a campaign strategy. Republicans continued to cozy up to big business, and when Ike left the White House, he warned Americans of the military-industrial complex. 1960 saw the Democrats find their voice in both an individual and a cause. The Civil Rights Movement came to a head, and Southern voters moved towards the Republican Party became a stampede. But the war in Vietnam and a tired, sick president resulted in the Republicans regaining the White House in 1968. They would hold it until 1992, except for 4 years when Ford made the mistake of pardoning Nixon. During those years, Americans got caught up with the idea of lower taxes, smaller government, the encouragement of individual rights over the rights of society. Reagan economics was to be the savior of America. This concept allowed social programs which had helped Americans to be either downsized or underfunded, and if possible, eliminated. Two major political parties drew the line in the sand. On one side was the party of small government, lower taxes, less government involvement, and the support of the individual. On the other side of the line was the party that recognized that not all individuals benefited from small government. That's the rights of many were being denied by the actions of the few, and that there were things the government could do to help all Americans. For nearly 30 years, things went well for the Republicans, but in the early 1990s, cracks in Reagan economics began to appear. It was led by the greed of individuals and big business. Companies like Walmart captured the buying public by providing products at the lowest possible price. Companies began to look throughout the world for cheaper possible produced items. First it was Japan, then Taiwan, and today it's China and India. First it was for clothing and toys. Then it became bigger items like automobiles, radios, TVs, cameras, computers. Free trade was the answer, as it would open American products to the world, and we would prosper as our products went worldwide. But as we imported cheaper goods and showed other countries how to improve the quality, we soon discovered our industrial leaders were now exporting jobs as well as products. As their profits went up, Wall Street fell in love with them and supported their efforts. And the Republicans failed to see the need to regulate big business, and when the economy faltered in the early 1990s, the Democrats took advantage to recapture the White House. In turn, the Democrats were able to ride the wave of a resurging economy, but they too failed to make things right. More and more American jobs went overseas, and America became dependent, not on jobs for producing goods, but on servicing others, constructions, and on tourism. By 2000, American people were once again not too sure who should lead the country, so they narrowly picked an individual who was an outsider, had experience running a government, and the support of the religious conservatives. In the end of trying to read and talk at the same time is sometimes difficult. But in the beginning of 2001, Bush came up as the uniter. He was able to bring together both parties to pass an educational bill. He tried to approach other important issues, but then 9/11 happened and everything went south. By 2007, cracks in the American economy had widened. The inability for government to regulate Wall Street, the shipping of jobs overseas, the need for funds to support two wars, the collapse of the housing market was too much for the economy, and it collapsed. This resulted in Americans looking for a savior. Americans did not want more of the same, and whoever won the Democratic nomination would become the next president, regardless of the Republicans' qualifications and abilities. After nearly 65 years since the end of World War II, America was no longer the leader of the world. Its education and health standards had slipped. Its industrial capacity no longer led the world. Instead of being a leader in technological advancement, it is in many cases and also ran. It became a world leader in polluting the atmosphere and a nation deep in debt. The worst was still to come. Shortly after electing a new president, instead of rallying behind him for the first time in American history, lines were immediately drawn to oppose him in a manner not seen since Andrew Johnson was president. Despite this, he took the states out of one of the worst economic periods in the country's history and established the groundwork for its continued success. The 2016 election was groundbreaking. Perhaps the least qualified candidate ever to represent a major political party ran and won. An individual used to doing things his way, not restricted by laws and established procedures. A person who made decisions based more on gut feeling than facts. A person used to looking at things with a view of what's in it for me. A person who had long memory of those who did him wrong. He was able to unite certain groups who had their own agenda by appealing to their basic urges. But those groups who supported the right of life, nationalism, or critics to global warming movements, at the same time was skillful in making his opponent less appealing. During his 4 years, he ran the country like a mafia boss. If you don't agree with him, you were replaced. If you spoke out against a decision, you were gone or ridiculed. If a document didn't agree with his beliefs, it was torn up and thrown in the toilet. When 81 million people said enough, he refused to accept their decision, told the biggest lie of all, and refused to concede, resulting in an attack on the Capitol and on democracy in the over 200 years of what has made America the greatest country the world has ever seen. Many Americans have yet to grasp that a majority of their fellow Americans chose a 78-year-old man over a 74-year-old wannabe dictator. even in states that voted Republican governors, senators, and congressmen, along with state legislators. They stole the election? I think not. The true test of a country's future will come in a few days. Will all the efforts by the Republicans to suppress the voter and votes bear fruit? Or will, despite their efforts, an overwhelming majority will vote to make America, the Republican Party, an afterthought? I don't know about you, but there's a lot of talk about the economy and that the Republicans will do better than the Democrats on the economy and inflation. Has not Biden passed some of the most I'll just leave it with this. The Democrats have done pretty damn well in developing bills and legislation that are going to help the economy. And you cannot overturn or turn around an economy that has been failing for the last 6 years overnight. 4 years of Trump, including the 2 years of the COVID, was a disaster for us. Our kids are suffering from it. You've seen the results of tests showing how kids suffered from not being in front of teachers. The same thing happened to our economy. And if you want to put and have the economy driven into a cliff, put the Republicans back. I know this is from an old man who up until recently has only voted Republican or conservative here in Canada. Yeah, I'll have a good day. We'll see you down the road.